Welcome to the Decolonising Development Research Podcast, brought to you by the Interdisciplinary Global Development Centre at the University of York, in partnership with the Federal University of Bahia in Brazil. So far in this series, we have explored the opportunities and practicalities of decolonising research partnerships and research methods. In this episode, we turn to decolonising research impact. Like many institutions, the University of York defines impact as when the knowledge generated by research contributes to, benefits and influences society, culture, the environment and the economy. This is a broad definition and has developed over time to encompass the diversity of benefits that research can bring. But does discourse and practice around impact need to develop further? Is there potential for impact too to be decolonised? To discuss these questions, I was joined by Professor Clarice Mota of the Institute of Collective Health at the Federal University of Bahia, where she focuses on the public health of communities affected by social vulnerability, racial inequality and neglected diseases, and by Dr. Tony Rohana of the Centre for the Comparative Study of Civil War at the University of York, where he researches the mobilisation of religious identity in conflict and in peace. In our conversation, Professor Mota discusses the Eclipse project. This is a 5-year cross-cultural applied health project with scores of researchers across 4 countries. You can find out more at eclipse-community.com. Similarly, you can explore Dr. Rohana's recent work at civilwarpaths.org. Professor Mota had some internet trouble at times in our conversation, but that's part of the challenge of collaborating internationally and with partners in developing countries, and her insights from her valuable experience are not to be missed. I hope you enjoy. Professor Mota, if I may start with you, could you tell us, perhaps in a sentence, how the University of Bahia defines research impact?
It would be complex because the Federal University of Bahia is so big and has so many departments and different scholars with different disciplines. I think it's very complex because I'm from social science and health. We have a perspective that impact should not only be limited to metrics or to numbers, but also include more qualitative data and more broad perception of impact regarding social impacts and some indicators of social impacts as well.
For your discipline, mainly of public health, why do you think that discipline needs to change? Why does it need decolonising, if you think it does?
Yeah, well, I do think it does. It's very common to start a research in a community and find people a bit fearful regarding the university researchers. So sometimes the communities feel that the university comes only to extract information and to collect data, and often don't really explain to the community members what is the purpose of the research, what are the benefits of these researches. So sometimes the university has a bad reputation, I would say. But so for me, this indicates that something's not really going well. So I think it's something that we need to work on, our communication, our strategies of engaging community. Because usually when people don't understand what we are doing, they will evaluate in a negative way because they are not being really engaged in the process.
Dr. Rohana, I see you nodding away there. Do you recognise in your discipline, mainly of sociology, some of the things that Professor Mota is saying?
Thank you for inviting us. It's a pleasure to be here. So I would point out to my colleague's work, Saira Vandenberg, titled Selling Stories of War in Sierra Leone, blog post in Open Democracy, where she tackles some of these issues that basically turned the whole research into an economy that researchers are engaged with, and the communities that we are researching became engaged with it as such, as an economy of basically information, rather than being a project that will impact societies, or that engages societies or finds them their place within this type of research to benefit from the research as such, rather than selling their stories for the researcher to go back to their institution and do their research. So I think this is a great piece to engage with, and I see it in many places in my field and in the work that we are engaged with.
And some scholars, like Comletze, have highlighted the disparity between the amount of research done on Global South and indigenous communities on the one hand, and the amount of benefit those communities have received. Professor Mota, why do you think research benefits have so long been concentrated in the Global North and within academic institutions?
It's part of the process of colonization. Usually, for example, when we apply for a grant, for example, or even when we send an article to publish internationally, sometimes we feel the pressure to use, for example, only English references when we do have Latin American wonderful scholars and even Brazilian scholars that publish in Portuguese. So it's part of the colonization process. And when we look at the benefits from the research, I think it means that the global north puts the standard of what would be the benefits. So sometimes the community is not even heard regarding what is benefits for them in their perspective. So I think it's part of the miscommunication that we have, because we are usually working on the standards of the global north.
Right, and you remind us that research can be part of the colonization process, and that impact, therefore, can have both positive and negative consequences. Dr. Ruhana, can you think of any examples where research has had a negative or damaging impact on a community?
So I'm not going to name specific research and the specific scholars. We have a lot of examples historically and recent examples, but I would go back and point out to the example I mentioned earlier, and then I will also add to what Professor Mota used as an example, which is an example that happened with my own research in terms of language. For example, in Sierra Leone, the example that I gave earlier, people are now dealing with the research as an exchange, as a transaction between the researcher and the institution behind them and the community or the people who are part of the research. So I'm going to give you a quote, for example, from that blog post. So someone is saying, and I'm quoting here, "For me, it's a win-win. My community respects me because I help them by bringing the researchers who pay them to talk. And I know what the researchers want to hear. So I teach people what to say when the researchers come." And this is where it's harmful, because most likely the researcher is going to the field with good intentions, or that's what I believe, basically. Most of us go to the field with good intentions, but when we end up with hearing what someone is supposing that we would like to hear, that this is a problem, because our findings might impact policy, will impact the findings that we have, and might impact their own lives. So, because to me, the research is not just staying within our books, it's also part of how policy is being produced. That's one. I will give you an example about the language. It's not only citation practices, it's also the language. So I have an article that was under review where I analyze data in Arabic as a language. I did the work of translating some of the visualizations from Arabic to English, but I kept the Arabic visualizations also as part of the article in a way of saying, look, these are the origins of these texts, and this is how I did the translation. I did the analysis in the original text, and then the translations are in English. One of the reviewers, anonymous reviewers, was asserting in, you should remove these because no one understands the language. And this is assuming that this is only for global North English speaking academics, and it doesn't deal with the possibility of, you know what? No, this is the original language. So I had to do the work of convincing the editor, like, I'm not going to publish the article unless these are there. And the editor was okay with that. But that's part of the language and colonization process, in a sense, that Professor Mota brought to the table.
Absolutely, that's a really good example of the idea of silencing, I suppose, non-Western, non-established, non-colonial voices. Professor Mota, you raised your hand. Was there something you wanted to come in on there?
Very, very good example. Just to add something to your previous question, one thing that for me it's very challenging is that usually the funders, they evaluate the impact of the output, and it's usually in the end of the research. And I think the process is just as important as the final outcome. So maybe to combine some evaluating process during the research in every stage will be better, even to prevent the mistakes and engage in the community in their process of evaluation so you can correct the problems that you find along the way.
You've brought me to the key question of this episode, which is, how can we work towards decolonizing impact? We've spoken about the potential for research to have both positive but also negative consequences. So there's great onus on the researcher, it seems to me, to get it right. And part of that is decolonizing. Dr. Ohana's mentioned language and translation. Professor Mota, can you start us off with another way you think research impact can be decolonized?
Well, I think it starts on the planning, even before the evaluation of the impact, because we should not make promises that it's not going to be feasible. So we should not promise to save communities or to save the world. So I think to be honest and very direct about the project and making everything clear in the planning process, I think it's very important. I also think that the language needs to be accessible. So sometimes we talk to communities in a way that we assume that they will understand. Also, I think it's important to make the communication easier as possible in terms of language accessibility and the terms that we use, not so many academic terms and things like that. So in the case of Eclipse project, which we are in the process of evaluation, we are ending the 4th year of Eclipse project. We used a lot of the strategies of popular education based in Paulo Freire's perspective. So we had the circles of communicating and talking about what's the main problems of the communities, how can we identify the priorities, and how can we plan the interventions. I don't really like the word intervention, but that's the common word that we use. It was a way to keep engaging the communities during the process of the research.
Okay, so communication seems key, engaging communities in ways that they can understand. Dr. Ohana, can these be applied in sociology in your experience of your research?
Yes, I think there is an active conversation about how to apply this, and we've been also applying these in terms of the ethics protocols that we develop in terms with all of the issues we have with the ethics protocol, but we can have a conversation about that. But we are trying to also have clearly state what the project is about, the scopes of the project to the community. But I also believe that we need to have conversations at different levels beyond only the researcher's responsibility to communicate what the research impact is about to the community, to also bring the conversation to the funders, to the institutional restrictions that are at play that do not overlap with the norms and cultures of some of the fields that we work with, assuming that our norms here are universal in a sense. Like, if we have these safety measures as part of our protocols, which come with good intention, this is enough for everyone around the world. And some communities do not accept these measures or these norms, and we end up with the responsibility on the researcher's part to deal with these issues and possibly to not communicate well the scopes and what the project is about, the language, because we need to balance, on the one hand, to be true to the ethics protocols and what we developed with our institutions, and on the other hand, we really want to do the work in these communities with these communities. So I think we have this conversation to have, as well as in terms of what Professor Mota highlighted. In many instances, we have now, at least in the field that I work in, we have what is called fixers. And now a lot of the research happens through specific people in these fields that are the go-to people, which end up with the quote that I highlighted earlier. Like, I'll be a representative of my community. I tell them what you want to hear, and you go do your work. And this is part of also the conversation that we need to have in terms of collaborations with the global South academics and grad students. Rather than hiring a fixer, maybe we can collaborate together with people in there, because they know the language, they know the norms, and they can be invested in such research.
You've both sort of brought me towards some of the challenges of decolonizing impact work. And Dr. Ohana, you just mentioned about institutions. You've both mentioned funders, and you've mentioned culture. So if we can take those sort of in turn, one of the issues that comes up again and again in the literature on decolonizing research and decolonizing impact is about identifying the needs and the wants of the local community where the research is taking place. However, a key question that I keep, sort of contemplating is what defines the community when we're working in global South and non-European contexts? Professor Mota, what counts as a community, in your work? How do you identify a single community in a way that doesn't perpetuate European or colonial norms?
This is very complex. Usually, for example, in Eclipse project, we created CAG groups, community advisory groups, all throughout the 4 years of the project. It was very interesting. We worked in 4 communities, and each community had a CAG group. Of course, it's not easy because you want to invite people from the community to join the group, and usually all these communities, they already have leaders. It's very common that they already have leadership groups, they have associations, they have religious leaders, they usually have teachers who are leaders, usually have health professionals who are leaders as well. But we don't want to perpetuate the hierarchy relationships that already exist in communities, because we cannot romanticize communities. Of course, they have power relations, they have conflicts. Every community has conflicts. So we don't want to create a group that only the people who are already leaders in the community can talk. So we also need to stimulate people that are usually unheard, um, youth, for example, young girls, young boys, people that are, in the case of Eclipse, agricultural men and women that used to work in agriculture, that they felt in the beginning that, well, I don't know how to talk, I'm not a scholar. Some of them don't know how to read and write, and they usually feel the difficulties in being in a group and to talk in the same group with the doctor, with the teacher. But we can stimulate, we can create a horizontal environment to say, well, everyone is important. Your experience is also important. You are agricultural, you are not a doctor, but you have your experience and you have your own knowledge. So everyone has the right to talk. Every opinion is important. We don't want to evaluate who is better than whom, but this is it. It really means that we need to mediate the groups in order to promote this horizontal environment.
Absolutely. It seems to me there's one of the great tensions of decolonizing research is, on the one hand, trying to recognize, respect, and include traditional cultures and attitudes, whilst also trying to work towards our own morals, if you like, and including people who might be marginalized within that community. So we can't, for instance, just rely on elders or traditional leaders, as you say, to represent the community. Do you think in the Eclipse project, your use of CAGs, these community groups, was that successful? Do you think it helped you get the perspectives of marginalized people more than you could have using traditional methods?
I think it was very successful, but for example, one challenging thing usually are women to join the groups. It was very interesting because sometimes we would invite the men to join, and they sometimes they would be at the door looking at it. It's not easy. Also, the youth, the teenagers, was very hard to engage them. They usually go to one meeting, to the two twice, and then the third time they just don't feel that it's not their place. So we usually had more women, middle age, old women. So the diversity in the group was very, very challenging, very challenging. But I think it was a wonderful strategy. I would advise to use it in other projects as well.
Dr. Oruhana, your work on conflict and peace, adds a further complexity and dimension to this. How can community research needs be determined in the midst of conflict when different communities might have different or even opposing interests?
This is one of the most complex issues that we have to deal with, especially at the level of the research design. And unfortunately, the structure that we work within does not allow for big mistakes to happen, like a whole research design to fail. So we end up trying to be open to just being able to bring in even traditional leadership at the end of the day. But we at our recent project at the Civil War Paths, we also developed a similar strategy where we have for each case study advisory board members who are part of the leading scholars in the field, but also leading local NGOs in these fields and these areas, because they are on daily basis dealing with such complexity, dealing with conflict, in my case dealing with sectarianism, dealing with post-war polarization in the case of Lebanon. And they are the best, or we don't have to take everything they say for granted, but they are the best suited to at least highlight possible issues that we might be facing within the field. So to me, it comes down also in these cases to have a solid research design, because there are people's lives at stake, peace at stake sometimes, and the community involved in the research has a lot to say in terms of also research design. So we have different examples from different case studies. We have Colombia, we have Lebanon, we have all of these places where we implemented such a design, and I think it was successful.
It seems that sometimes the use of or the reliance on brokers, intermediaries, can really exert quite an influence on a research project. And surely, if a research is going to be decolonized, that involves giving up a little bit of control over research, perhaps. And so I wonder, sometimes are the interests identified by the community, by the brokers, might they be different from the initial priorities of the researcher? For example, in development studies, should a project focus on creating a groundbreaking peer-reviewed article, or should its priority be to improve standards of living in the global south? And those things might be separate. Dr. Hunt, to go back to you, do you think that decolonizing impact does detract from a researcher's professional interests? And is this a problem we have to deal with?
Sometimes it does. And unfortunately, based on the institutional structures that we are living in, we have to choose. And most of the times, the choice is at the end of the day going to be like, I need to deal with myself in different ways. And that's the unfortunate aspect of it. And I'm going to be honest about it here. And it also puts more pressure on the researcher to do the other part at their own time and their own expense and their own effort in different ways. And in many ways, these communities don't ask much. I can give an example maybe. So, for example, the community that I work with, the ex-combatants who turned peace activists in Lebanon, they are not asking much. They're just asking for their names to be part of the quotations that we are using. But the research and the university rules, we have to preserve anonymity, even though we can make the case for like they are publicly active. They're not hiding their identities. They're not hiding what they've done. And sometimes they end up telling us as researchers, I don't want to give you my quote and then see it somewhere with a different name. And this is part of where we need to also deal with all of these institutional limitations that are at play in research.
Absolutely. I can tell you're both itching to get onto the institutional question. Professor Mota, you've got your hand raised. What would you like to say?
Yeah, I was just going to add something about this topic that we in Eclipse, we found both situations. Sometimes the community would feel that the university could save them, and they had like this long list of demands, some of them really impossible. For example, oh, the main problem here is the roads, the access, the mobility that in rural areas like the ones we worked in Eclipse projects, like rural areas, dirt roads, and they felt, oh, this is our problem, not really leishmaniasis. And sometimes they would feel, oh, the university can really save things. And the opposite, also some discredit about university. Oh, you often come here, you come with these projects and you don't do anything, you just collect data and then you never come back. So we had situations, and both of them are very challenging. On one hand, we also need to limit the idea that diversity is a savior. And on the other hand, we also need to work on this feeling of extraction that the community usually feel like university is coming to extract. So we need to work on to improve our relationships with the communities as well.
How do you think researchers can combat this idea of researchers and universities as extractors? How can we best combat that?
I think we need to be very open in terms of negotiating what do you need here in the community. So what are your priorities? And sometimes we, for example, if the focus of the project is leishmaniasis, but you can look at leishmaniasis in a broader sense and think that this disease is also related to social determinants of health. So then you can feel, well, I can work on education, I can help improve some problems that are not directly related to leishmaniasis, but are in a broader sense related to quality of life. So yes, the project can work to improve other things as well that community feels is more important to them. So in Eclipse, we had a lot of interventions directly related to leishmaniasis, but we also had many interventions that were regarding broader sense of agriculture, environment, talking about education, health as a human right, and we worked in many topics.
So far, we've addressed some of the personal challenges, the researcher challenges in decolonising impact. So now it's finally time to turn at last to the institutional challenges. In other episodes in this series, we've addressed ways that institutions like universities and funding bodies both support and resist decolonial research practices. In academia, scholarly publication and filling the gap in academic knowledge is still seen as the priority, whereas decolonising research places greater emphasis on real-world benefits as the main purpose of research. So I wonder if this leads to conflict between researchers and their institutions. And then within impact itself, there is a presumption that institutions favour impacts that can be easily measured and quantified, but a lot of what we've been discussing is hard to evaluate using established measurements. It involves things that Roxanne Bainbridge and others have called intangibles. So, Professor Mota, in your experience, how supportive are research institutions towards decolonising impact?
Well, I think we have a long road to run still. We are not in a good place at the moment. I think the debate under decolonizing is just in the beginning. We still face the meaning of impact is still related to numbers, to quantifiable results. It's very hard to talk about qualitative indicators. So I think we do have to improve a lot. And I also, for me, to be very sincere, it's also very challenging to face the scientific, the academic world in terms of we are always looking to try to show that the researches were very easy to be done. And even when you look at a thesis or a report or final report of a research, usually we try to present our results like everything went very nice, everything gone smoothly, everything happened just how it was expected. And this is not true. Everyone faces things that are not going as expected. Everything, it's very common to things that are not going really well when you need to change your strategies. But I think we also need to discuss how scientific world, how academic world deals with evaluation, and to be more realistic, to be more truth to ourselves, so that would not create so many frustration. And that's, to be very honest.
Yes, thank you. Dr. Ruhana, do you agree? Do you think there's quite a long way to go, but institutions are more or less receptive to decolonising impact?
I agree with the long way to go. And I agree that we need to run also. I see advancement within the academy, that's for sure. Within the conversations that we're having, that's for sure. But we're still far from what, at least I think, we need to be. For example, in terms of conferences, we have a lot of our collaborators from the global south who are part of our research who cannot get a visa to come to the conferences that we have here, to be part of the decolonization of these conversations and the research. While I have seen limited interest in like having these conferences, even area studies conferences, in the places where we are studying, where people can easily join without having to go through the visa hurdle. Or, for example, colleagues got their visa after the conference. So that's also part of what we are dealing with in terms of like, there are some moves that, in a sense, can be done without having to change the laws, without having to have like the deep conversation that can contribute to decolonizing research and decolonizing output.
Okay, and what about funders as well as universities and other institutions? Do you think funding agencies are supportive and receptive to alternate forms of impact in your experience?
I think this is a deeper conversation with the whole political economy of research and research funding. And I think a lot of the fund and funding options are tied to tangible, quantifiable outputs that need to be there. Because at the end of the day, those institutions are saying we need to show our funders this type of impact. And we cannot just say, look, we changed everything, but you can't see it now. So you have to show it. But the whole quantifying impact does not have to be necessarily in terms of numbers. It can be in different ways to show how impact what happened in these societies, in these places, rather than having to say, look, I have this measurement and this is how it happened. It could be in terms of showcasing different cases. It could be in different ways, and we can show impact. But it has to happen within the conversation, because that's the main issue. Who would start first? Who would take the first step? Who is willing in terms of funding to say, you know what, I will accept a report that does not include these numbers? Pre-research, post-research, 30%, 45%, we improved 15%, this is great. So, and this is a part of a bigger conversation with researchers saying, look, this needs to happen, rather than saying, you know what, it's not the time for it now. Let me just keep within the system and then work within the system. And this is not to say I work outside of the system. I'm part of the whole working within the system. So it's not a criticism to other scholars, but that's like the reality of the situation.
Absolutely, it is. Professor Mota, Eclipse, the project on leishmaniasis, which you worked on, it was a huge funded project. How did you try to measure or evaluate that project's impact?
I think one very challenging thing, because Eclipse project is a participatory research. Our goal is not only to produce knowledge and to publish, but we also have the intention of changing reality in these communities. So it's been very challenging since the beginning, because you can imagine a participative methodology, but the funder wants all the things that you are going to do in 4 years. So the funders require us to describe the methodology. But since it's a participative, how can you be defining in the beginning? So this was the first very challenging. Now we are having meetings with the communities. We are doing evaluation process. We are also working with stakeholders. So we have also having meetings with managers. We are working in an interdisciplinary way. So we're not only having meetings with the health sector, but also including the agriculture managers, the education managers, and health assistants. So we are trying to create an idea that leishmaniasis is not only a problem of health sector. So we are doing this intersectional, trying to co-produce the evaluation with them and also with the community. So we are doing some round talks, and we are in the process of also using interviews with community members and try to listen to them. What went wrong? What was good? What are the positive aspects of Eclipse? What could do better? So we are in this process at this point now in the fourth year of Eclipse.
It will be so interesting to see the end results, when you've come to the end of, this reflective and evaluative stage of Eclipse project. Another thing I wanted to ask you both about is that in some cases where decolonized research really serves the interests of the local community, it may have the potential to become quite politicized. For instance, Aram Zai has written about indigenous resistance to development projects in India and Mexico. And in these instances, can decolonizing research risk turning researchers into what Derrickson and Routledge have called scholar activists? This can be controversial and even dangerous in some situations. Dr. Ohana, do you think this is a challenge that researchers need to be aware of when decolonizing impact?
In general, I don't think so. But there are exceptions, of course, and we have to be wary of these exceptions. To me, researchers as activists is not necessarily a bad connotation or a bad thing to do, especially in terms of like environmental research that we see now. I have a lot of colleagues who do environmental work and environmental research, and they are activists. They are part of these communities. They mobilize, they do this work. It makes it more difficult to abide by the academic rules of publishing, of dissemination, of all of that. But most of them do this work, and they are willingly doing such work. Like they publish according to academic research rules, and it does not need to conflate that. But they also publish their own opinion pieces, for example, which is part of a different way of impact. Like, this is my opinion about the whole subject. This is my political leaning. This is why I need to mobilize, and we need to be aware of this and that in these situations. But also, these are the findings. It makes it difficult not to say, look, you're biased, but it's happening. And a lot of this research is showing that it's not a biased research in many fields, including war studies, including environmental studies, including sociology in general.
Professor Mota, you wanted to come in there?
I totally agree. I think science is never neutral. I think we are always advocating pro something, against something. And we just need to be clear about it and talk about the reasons. And so it's not even true to say that, no, we are here, we don't have an opinion. Have an opinion. We always have something to fight for. And I think this just needs to be very open and honest about it.
That brings me on to a really specific point I wanted to ask you about, Professor Mota, because thinking about the idea of scholar activists and researchers becoming almost politicized by forefronting impact in their work, even public health research can become political and controversial. For instance, in the Eclipse project, I was reading that some of your colleagues discovered that traditional healers in some places were trying to treat leishmaniasis by burning the sores, which of course made things so much worse for the patient. And in this case, it would seem that a positive outcome from the Eclipse research would be to eradicate that traditional practice. But that sort of goes against one of the key tenets of decolonizing research, which is recognizing and including traditional cultures. So, Professor Mota, do you recognize that struggle? And how, in Eclipse, did you deal with that that sort of dichotomy between, as you say, science, which isn't impartial, and respecting culture?
Yes. Well, so Eclipse, we had 4 countries involved. This situation that you are describing is about Ethiopia environment, and so the Ethiopian context, they found out that the traditional healers, the practice were very harmful for the disease. But in Brazil, it was actually the opposite. We had to really try to embrace local knowledge because they have very strong feelings about medicine and how they, what is the, for example, the biomedical itinerary of leishmaniasis. So they all go to the reference center, they take the medicines, they have this knowledge of how to identify the lesion and say, this is leishmaniasis, I need to go to the reference center, because our reference center here is very successful, working for more than 30 years. But when we went to the communities, we also found out that they had a very rich knowledge about herbal treatments that, of course, we never said, oh, avoid the medicine, don't take injections and only use the herbs. No, we never did. We never did that. We never told them that. But we always encourage them to say, well, this is local knowledge. This is very important. And you can combine some herbal treatments with the medical treatments. It's not going to harm you. They know what type of foods you should avoid during the treatments because are foods that create more inflammation. But when we talk to them in interviews and talk to some nutritionists, actually it makes a lot of sense that some foods are really not good when you have an inflammation and when you're trying to heal in a lesion. So this knowledge is precious. We did really work in a way that we never said that the scientific treatment was wrong or not believable, never, because this is a very successful treatment for more than 30 years. But we also try to recognize and to acknowledge that their culture, their local culture, and the local knowledge is very, very rich and very important for them.
And we're drawing to the end now, but Dr. Uruhana, do you recognize some of the things that Professor Mota is saying about tolerating other cultures and trying to sort of bridge the divides potentially between cultures in your own work?
Not as clear as Professor Mota's example, but in my work, for example, in Syria, there is still a whole big weight for the tribal leadership. And as much as we can say it's just political pragmatism, we have political actors, there is still a big space that is occupied by the tribal leadership, for example. And if you don't try to bridge that in peace building, which requires knowledge of their norms and cultures, and it does not have to be necessarily either this or that. It is a conversation, and they're not just stuck in one place. They don't tell you this is how we do it. Some of them might tell you that. It's the fact of anyone can tell you, like, this is what I believe, this is what I do, and this is it. Whether they're in that region in a tribal situation or not. But most of them would have a conversation about it, and you can reach a compromise where, yes, for example, let's do it in this place, and we will do it according to what you are proposing, or let's do some of what you're proposing alongside of what we know or what our norms and cultures dictate should happen. And this is where we need to be open to that possibility rather than we are going there to teach you what to do. And this is the only way to do it because we know what we're talking about, especially if we have these numbers. We know what we're talking about because these are the quantifiable numbers that we have. And this is where it creates a big problem. They would take these numbers if you show, like, look, I respect what you're doing. I would abide by this and this and this, and I will not accept this. And it happens in a conversational way, I think.
Absolutely. In many ways, you bring us full circle back to the first episode in this series, which addressed partnerships and decolonizing research partnerships, which is all about what you just said about, not going in with this idea about what's right, what's wrong, and how we're going to do something, but involving other people in the conversation and in the research design. As I say, we are getting to the end of our time, but I always like to leave these things on a positive note. So, Professor Mota, if I can come to you for a final word, perhaps, on a piece of advice you could give a researcher who's starting a project or thinking about a project and they really want to work towards decolonizing that impact, what would you say is a key thing they can and should do?
I think it would be to learn to listen more than to talk, and to learn to be open to learn with different people, with different perspectives, and to not start thinking that you have all the answers and that you are superior in any way. So I think we need to be grounded in this sense.
It's always good to be grounded and to be humble. Dr. Ruhana, any words of wisdom?
I think collaboration is critical. With local collaboration is critical for all of these types of research that involve decolonizing and field work. So that's, in a nutshell, what I would say, actually.
Okay, that's wonderful. And with those words of very astute advice, I'm afraid we've come to the end. So my thanks go to Professor Mota and to Dr. Ruhana and to you for listening. Safe travels and happy researching.